Good morning, everyone. In this week's overview video, I wanted to sit down with you and talk about the SSI. I'm very aware that it's a weird and tricky assignment, and it can be difficult to understand exactly what you need to do in it. So I wanted to make sure that we had some time to break it down and make it clear exactly what you needed to do. So for that reason, I had you do the exercise last week, where you sat down and tried to explain the SSI in your own words. I'd like to start by looking at some of your responses, which I felt highlighted some really important things you need to be aware of in the SSI. So we're going to start with this first response by Wen-Chi. Wen-Chi says, the SSI is a strategy used to integrate secondary sources into the original PSA in order to make claims more convincing and supportive. It is based on the initial PSA and then extends, adds, extracts, or revises it to prove the claims through evidence. Thus, the SSI contains more evidence which is woven through the text. This SSI asks us to use sufficient evidence to support our claims in the PSA and also involves revising the initial opinions in the PSA. So I think Wen-Chi is hitting on a number of really important things here. First of all, your SSI is based on your PSA. It's not an entirely new assignment. You start by taking your PSA, revising it, and then adding additional material into it. So let's look at this next one by Amir, which I think hits on some other really important issues. Amir says, the SSI is a method of weaving your secondary sources into your PSA with the purpose of strengthening your argument and analysis. In essence, your PSA is the foundation and the SSI is the building. The SSI works by adding extra information that will prove and support the statements in the PSA. This makes the PSA seem more academic, since plenty of evidence is provided through the SSI, thus making the entire piece more believable and persuasive. So I really like Amir's analogy of the PSA being the foundation and the SSI the building. Ultimately, your analysis serves as the foundation for the claim you're going to build on it, the issue you're going to explore through it. And it's important to think of the purpose of the information you're bringing in, as Amir did here. On the one hand, it can improve your logos by bringing in more evidence. On the other hand, it can also improve your ethos by bringing in credible authorities who feel the same way as you do. Last but not least, we have this one by Brian, which I think is also really good. So the SSI involves identifying two credible, useful sources that will provide avenues to continue further discussion. The ideas presented in the secondary sources need to be incorporated into the same information from the PSA in a useful and effective manner, not necessarily just to support or agree with your main point. It's important to let the sources speak, but also to make sure they're simply a part of the conversation, but not the whole conversation. The SSI is a tough step in the writing process, but is very valuable. I think that Brian's touching on a number of really important points here. So first of all, you're going to want to use your evidence from your secondary sources to do a whole range of things. You don't only necessarily want to bring it in just to support or agree with what you're saying. Second of all, it's really important to make sure that your sources are speaking, but they aren't part of the whole conversation. You don't want your own voice to get lost in the process. You want to talk about your secondary sources. You want to talk back to them. You really want to make sure that they're just one voice. You have a voice, they have a voice. Your primary source also has a voice. And you want to give all of those space. Okay, so I think those three responses pick up on some really, really important aspects of the secondary source integration. Others of yours did as well, but I didn't want this video to be too long. So I just picked three that were kind of representative of the ideas that I saw coming up in your discussions and I thought needed to be foregrounded. Okay, so what I want to move on to talking about now is precisely what you need to do in the SSI. So let's talk basic requirements first of all. Your SSI is 45 pages in length. That means you're adding on roughly 2 to 3 pages of length to your PSA. It's double-spaced, it's in 12-point font, and it has 1-inch margins. I think all of that's relatively straightforward. Next, your secondary source integration needs to revisit the PSA in some way. As Amir said, the PSA is going to be the foundation on which you build your SSI. So you really want to make sure that foundation is strong and solid. That means you're going to want to read over your PSA and look at all of my comments on it. Based on that, you're going to decide what changes you need to make to it. So do you need to expand some parts? Do you need to delete others? And you really should be prepared to do a major rewrite at this point. You might need to rethink your PSA significantly before moving on to the SSI. And just as a reminder, you do have the option to rewrite the PSA for a new grade, and I would like those in tonight by 11:59 p.m. just so I can look at them, give you feedback again before you actually work on the SSI. So after you've spent time reworking your PSA, you're going to want to pick your sources. We recommend that you choose at least 2 sources from your annotated bibliography. You can use 3 or 4 if you wish, but in that case, make sure that they aren't taking over. You still want to make sure your own voice is there, that it isn't just a conversation between your secondary sources. And then think about what you need those sources to do in your new, improved PSA. You have various options here. You can use them to give background information. You can use them to support your claims. You can use them to complicate your claims. In other words, show aspects of them that you hadn't considered. You can even use them to provide alternative, opposing claims against which you can set up your own claim. So you have a number of options. Don't simply think about using your sources just to support what you have to say. Next up, you're going to want to use your sources, and that means integrating your secondary sources into the primary source analysis at the moments where they seem most appropriate. So, for instance, background information is usually going to go towards the beginning of the document, because it's telling your reader what they need to know to understand the rest of your analysis and argument. It's part of the setup process at the beginning. By way of contrast, information that supports or complicates one of your claims will logically go wherever you make that claim. So at a point where you're making a particular claim using a secondary source to back it up, that's where you're going to want to bring in the secondary source. That's where you're going to want to have a moment of conversation. And then lastly, information that actually challenges your claims will often go towards the end of the document. It's a good idea to set up your own points first, to convince your readers of them, before you introduce another perspective. It just makes it so much easier to argue against that perspective if you've already given your reader your side of the argument and kind of basically convinced them of it already.